Okay, so I'm going to talk this morning about evidence-based practices and interventions, mostly from the United States, but there actually have been tested all over the world at this point. So we're going to do a very fast, sort of broad strokes through evidence-based practices, based on some of my research, but also replicated by other folks or similar to what other folks are doing. So we'll talk a little bit about what we know, and I'll explain what I mean by evidence-based, what we've learned from research, and then what we think about in terms of the future. So what we currently know is that children with autism need behavioral interventions. We don't have medications that can improve development by itself. But there are lots of different types of behavioral interventions. So it's clear that not one type of intervention is going to work for all children with autism. But we haven't actually compared different models or different packages. So we can't really say that there's one approach that's better than another. But some approaches have not been tested. Some approaches have been tested widely, and we know a lot about them. And so we're going to focus more on those that have been tested. And when I talk about evidence, what I'm really referring to are studies that have undergone some kind of scientific study, some rigorous comparison. So not a case study, because there are always case studies out there of a child who's benefited from some type of therapy. But because it hasn't been tested across a lot of different children, we can't say that it's scientifically proven. All right, so we're going to focus on those that have some research behind them. So in general, behavioral interventions involve a high dose. So there's a belief that sort of the best practice is about 20 hours a week of intervention. And that's all interventions. It could be going to school. It could be different kinds of therapies like speech therapy or occupational therapy. Lots of different kinds of things, art therapy, for example. All of those therapies together for about 20, 25 hours a week. The structure is often one-to-one in the beginning. But we want to move to having a child in a group situation, in a school situation. It does require trained professionals, people that know something about autism. But the interventions are right now fairly complicated, and they need to be simpler if we're ever going to have everybody using evidence-based practices. A lot of times the kinds of interventions that are done require a lot of repetition, a lot of practice, and about half of all children in all studies make incredible progress. About half, regardless of whether you're using any different model of a behavioral approach. And when I'm talking about behavioral approach, I'm talking about the way in which we look at behaviors to judge whether or not a child has made progress. So there are different types of approaches that rely on applied behavior analysis. And I know you've heard about this because people have been talking about this all week. It's really characterized by very clear prompts or expectations and then reinforcement for the correct response. It's a very basic kind of teaching approach. The outcomes from the studies that have been done have often relied on IQ, and we talked about this before. The outcomes are much weaker for some of the social interaction and language outcomes. And an important issue always concerns how well the child has learned that skill, so whether or not they can maintain the skill and whether or not they can generalize the skill. So if they learn the skill with one person, can they generalize to another person? So I'm going to show you some clips from, this comes from the Autism Speaks website. So if you go on to the Autism Speaks website, there are examples of lots of different intervention packages. You can just click through and get an idea of what those are about. So I've chosen two that are very commonly used in the United States. You also had some information on floor time, and those clips are on the website as well. But you've already heard some about that. So these are a little bit more structured ABA approaches. The first one is called Discrete Trial Training, and it's based on Lovas's work from UCLA from a long time ago, but it's still being used. So do you want to show that first clip? So it's clear this child is not very verbal.
Beautiful, number 7.
And is doing, responding on a speech-generating device.
Number 4. Look, what number is it? 13. Very nice, number 13. Good for you.
Okay, we can stop that one.
What number is it? 1. Beautiful, Ben. Look, what number
Do I
is
stop
it?
that one? I think it goes on.
Very.
This is the one that's on the Autism Speaks website, so it's not from my lab. But you can see that she's giving a clear prompt, and then she's reinforcing or praising him when he does the correct response. The next video is called Pivotal Response Training. It's very similar to the discrete trial approach, but it's using naturalistic reinforcers. It's supposedly less prompt oriented, but you'll see that it's still very adult directed. So the instructor is giving a clear choice. You want this one or that one? And then going with whatever the child chose. But it's still very adult-directed. Both of those models are very adult-directed. The instructor has control of the materials, has control of what's going to happen. So it's a little bit different than some of the more developmental models. So one of the issues has always been that the applied behavior analysis approaches have focused less on the core deficits that are important to child language acquisition. You know, as I said, the outcomes are weaker for language. A lot of our children are very delayed in language skills. And so it's important to focus more on some of those core deficits I talked about, I think it was yesterday. So joint attention, initiations, things like pointing to share an experience or showing a toy to the parent. So pointing, showing, symbolic play skills. So those kinds of skills that require some imagination or some pretense. And those are the real core deficits of really young children with autism. Those are the kinds of skills we want to target. They are not very often targeted using ABA approaches. In the last 5 to 7 years, that has changed dramatically in that they are now trying to focus on those skills given the literature or the evidence that has been accumulating that those targets are important to language outcome. So in order to focus on those core deficits, we developed a model at UCLA that uses both developmental approaches and behavioral approaches that really address those core deficits. So I'm a researcher primarily. I'm a clinical researcher. My interest was whether or not we could change some of the core deficits and whether we got better outcome in children as a result of that. So we developed a model called JASPER, which just stands for joint attention, symbolic play, engagement, and regulation. And regulation has to do with both emotion regulation and behavioral regulation. These are what children, typical children, learn in the first few years of life. All of those skills are developmental. And if you think about Vygotsky, for example, who was the famous Russian philosopher, and in the United States, people love that approach. So it really is using adult support to help children sort of move through whatever that zone of proximal development is. So both developmental, but also some behavioral approaches, some prompting, some reinforcement of specific skills. So what we know about Jasper is that by focusing on social communication problems of children, we can increase engagement with people, we can increase initiations of joint attention, and that's important because if we're doing an adult-directed approach, all we're getting are responding, and we're not getting those initiations that are so important to language development. We can improve play skills, and then we can facilitate language development. So it's a process. There have been several studies of Jasper now, some from my lab, and another one, and another one, and then there have been several replications by other labs across the country. Okay, so what does it look like? So I'm gonna, so a lot of my research projects are focused on minimally verbal children because we're trying to develop their spoken language. So I'm going to show you a 4-year-old boy that came into a study for minimally verbal children. So by the age of 4, you would expect that a child would be fluent in sentences. This child has fewer than 20 words that he can use, and you'll see that his play skills are not very well developed for a 4-year-old. So let's look at the first video. This is a play assessment in his school. So he uses sort of baby gibberish talk, but he does have a few words. His play skills are, not that well developed. And so after about 4 months of treatment, he's seen every day at school for about an hour, and it's just added into his school program. We can look at the next video. And when Jasper is done well, it looks like you're just playing. So, this is a child who's now talking in full sentences. He was probably high functioning to begin with, right? He had skills. He just wasn't performing those skills. And then by giving him this opportunity, a context in which typical children learn to talk. They learn to talk with other people. They learn to talk while they play around, activities. But those activities have to be developmentally tied to where that child is cognitively. You can't go too high and you can't go too low. So it requires some knowledge about development. And so we do a lot of assessment beforehand. We figure out what those goals are, and then we move children up along the play levels that have been well documented in typical development. So it really is a combination of developmental and behavioral strategies. And you need both. So, in general, in terms of approach and dose, we know that children with ASD need some intensity in their interventions. How many hours per week is unknown because it hasn't really been tested. But it's generally recommended between 20 and 25 hours. One way to increase dose is to focus in on parents. So we try to teach parents. We have parent training as part of my research projects, but we don't expect parents to do all of the therapy. It's a burden to have to do the therapy for your child and to be the parent. However, in the United States, children have the opportunity to go to school, so there is somebody else to help. When you don't have any other outlet for training children, then parents are more responsible for that therapy. And so we've also done parent training. This is a study with toddlers. We can increase engagement. And if we don't work with the parents, nothing changes. So the bottom line is engagement when we haven't done anything. And we randomize parents to get the treatment early, first, or to get the treatment second, so that we can measure whether or not there's a change as a result of the treatment. Next slide. So the kinds of strategies that we would teach parents or that we use with therapists are very systematically taught, because our treatments are only about 3 months, because I'm a researcher. So even though children need long-term intervention, you know, they have other programs to go to, and our goal is to figure out what works and what works when, so that we can teach other people about how to do these interventions and to keep it going. So if you look, you can just go ahead and go through all of these. There's a whole series of different things that we're going to teach. So we would teach first about how to arrange the environment. What kinds of toys are at the right developmental level? What kinds of activities should you be working on? How do you allow the child to initiate the activity and then following in, paying attention to what the child's interests are? How do you establish a play routine that's not repetitive, not too fixed, but not too high, not too above the child's cognitive level? How do you maintain that level of engagement? How do you imitate the child? How do you model different gestures? How do you talk? What kind of language should you use? So we teach that sort of week by week. Okay, next slide. We've also done this with teachers, and we know that, you know, we can teach teachers how to use the strategies. And when we do that, and we have people go into the classroom who are what we call blind observers, they don't know which treatment the children are in, we find that the children initiate more joint attention in their classrooms. So the strategies work, and they work whether we're teaching parents or therapists or teachers. And then we've developed teacher materials. So next slide. So that we give teachers also handouts, and we teach them kind of like we teach parents or therapists, sort of strategy by strategy. Okay, so I want to talk about an issue that I don't know that we've talked about yet, and one is that young children are what we would call pre-verbal. They haven't started talking yet, but we expect that they're going to talk. So they're pre-verbal. They're not nonverbal. When you're 2 years, 3 years of age, you're not nonverbal if you have autism. You're pre-verbal. Most of those children will go on and have language, but about 25 to 30% remain nonverbal or minimally verbal, up to 50% depending on how much treatment children have had early. Those children, we also have a study for. So these are children at age 5 who still are not talking, and we refer to them as minimally verbal, and I'll show you what I mean by that. And what we're using with those children are an augmentative or speech output device, along with the Jasper therapy. So you can play, this is just showing you the heterogeneity in kids who are minimally verbal. Okay, so you have everything from a child who cannot make the sounds, you know, physically can't make the sounds, to children who use scripted language or rote language. Those are all considered minimally verbal children. So it's defined in different ways in studies, from under 10 words, under 20 words, under 30 words. So it's more likely that a child has some language. They just may not have very much functional language. So I'm going to, so we have a project for 5 to 8-year-old children who remain minimally verbal. And these are children who have had at least 2 years of early intervention. Most of those children had 40 hours a week of discrete trial training. So these are not children who haven't had access to services. But because the services were not effective, right? Because they're not effective with every child, we're trying to figure out what it takes to get those children to talk or to communicate better. So this is a little guy who's actually age 8, almost age 9, who came in echoing words. He was at the one-word stage of development to begin with. So you'll see the therapist in the first session trying to play with him, and he does echo some of the play words. So you can play the... All right, so he's communicating more. He's also using the device. So what's critical here is that he's just connected more, he's playing more, and he's communicating more. We're not making him, normal. We're not making him totally fluent in his talking, because we only see him for, in this study, 6 months. But the children do go on to make big improvements. And if we go back to the one before, this is a little guy that had been he's 8 years old. He'd been kicked out of every single preschool, and it was a special education preschool, for his screaming behavior, which you'll hear. In his first session, we just tried to get close to him because he didn't want to have anything to do with people. And because he was fairly aggressive, we had 2 people in there just, to be safe. And it shows what he looks like after 2 sessions a week for 3 months, and then 2 sessions a week for another 3 months.
Slide down.
He says slide.
Let's
slide down.
Let's slide down roller coaster.
And you can see how the therapist just adds 1 to 2 words after he talks. He's also seeking that sensory input that you've heard about, so he's leaning into her. He has a lot of sensory needs. But the good thing about this little guy is he got to go back to school because his behavior became very regulated by giving him access to communication. He's a smart kid. He needed access to be able to talk about anything and to communicate with another person. And you can see the change in his words on the graph from when he came in to when he left. So I think it was like 43 novel, different words that he hadn't used before. Okay, let's go to the next slide. I'm showing you lots of video. So I want to show you one way in which we measure change for these kids who are minimally verbal and why it's not about IQ. So this is a little boy on a language sample. We do a standardized language sample, which speech therapists sometimes do in the United States. It's also an outcome measure that we use. It's very standard. The tester is not that talkative because we're trying to see what the child brings to the assessment. And you'll see this little guy changes in the functions of his communication over time. He came in with no words, and he's, I think, 6 or 7. And his IQ nonverbal is normal, average. This is at 3 months.
Giraffe.
So he uses giraffe with no clear intent, but he's saying words.
Big ball, please. Big ball, please.
So it's a request, big ball, please. And he's pairing that request with eye contact. It's a snowman. Funny in California. We don't see snow.
Snowman.
So that's a comment, right? And a comment is related to joint attention. So you want to move through the functions of language from not just requesting language, but to actually commenting on something to another person. So he changed in his ability to say words and to communicate, but his language scores don't change. And his IQ is already average. So we're not trying to change his IQ, but we are trying to change his communication. And so that's why the outcome measures we use are important to think about. Okay, and this graph shows so we did a randomized controlled trial comparing children getting Jasper and a blended language intervention with an augmentative system, like a Dynavox or an iPad, or without. So the thing we manipulated was whether or not they had that device. And the top line, the black line, is kids benefited from having the iPad or the device. So just getting that additional input tells us who the sort of popular kids are, who the isolated kids are, which kids are just kind of in the mix. So those, so the numbers tell us how many kids nominated them to a group, and the number in the middle tells us how central that group is in that classroom. So the two little boys in blue on the bottom don't have any connections to other groups, so they're what we would call isolated, but they don't have autism. All right? So the child with autism is in red, Sam, and he's connected to one other child. All right? And this is, I've done this now with thousands of typical kids and hundreds of kids with autism in different studies. So we see the same pattern over and over again. Kids with autism are not completely isolated in these situations. And if we go to I think it's the next slide, we know that some kids are even popular. So about anywhere from 8 to 20% of kids are popular in their classrooms. These are children from kindergarten to about 5th grade. We also know that the majority of kids with autism are what we call peripheral. They're connected a little bit to a group, or they're hanging on to kind of the fringes of a group. And they are more isolated than typical kids, but they're not overwhelmingly isolated. So they're kind of in the mix. And our goal is always to try to increase the number of connections they have in the classroom, because we want all kids to feel like they belong in that classroom and that they belong to a peer group. Okay, next slide. Oh, you got it. So we did a study where we randomized children. It was about 60 children to either get a child-assisted approach or a peer-mediated approach. So typically there's one child with autism in a classroom of typical children. So that one child would either get an adult to work with them on whatever their issues were on the playground, or we would just work with 3 typical peers in the classroom and not with the child with autism. All right? So the next slide. So the child-assisted approach meant that we would watch what happened on the playground, figure out what the child's problems might be. So sometimes, children don't know how to play the game, or they're very aggressive, or they just want to be by themselves. So whatever the issue was, we tried to figure that out. And then we listed the top 3 problems, and then we worked one-on-one with the child, one problem at a time, in a short period of time, 6 weeks. So we saw the child twice a week at school for 6 weeks. In the peer-mediated approach, we used 3 peers from the classroom that were willing to participate. And I want you to know that we always had too many children who wanted to participate. The kids wanted to participate. That was never an issue for us. The peers, we would just work with peers and talk about, are there kids on the playground who have trouble making friends or that don't know how to play the games? And they would identify lots of kids, not just our kids with autism. And we would work on strategies in their school, on their playground, that they could try to help those kids get more engaged. Okay, so what we found, again, that was twice a week as well. What we found, what do you think we found? Which treatment worked better? Working one-on-one with the child on their specific individual problems, or working with the peers and not the child with autism? Okay, what's that in English? What are they saying?
The second.
Second? Peers. Ah, you're so smart. So smart. That's right. And that is not what I hypothesized at all. I thought it would be the opposite. You guys are smarter than I am. So, yeah, the peer-mediated worked better. And we actually had 4 conditions. So we did one where we combined the two, peer and one-on-one. And then we had some kids who just got inclusion and not the treatment. So what we know about this is that those maps that I showed you were the kids got more connected if they got the peer-mediated intervention. And you can see in the graph there that at time 2, which was only 6 weeks, the kids were much improved. And when we came back in 3 months and did the maps again, and we hadn't been at the school for those 3 months, the kids had maintained those networks. So if we go to the next slide, you'll see that in the top corner here, E5, down at the bottom, was a little girl who was isolated at time 1. When we came back, she got the peer-mediated intervention. So in 6 weeks, you can see her. She's connected now to a group. And when we came back in 3 months, so on the bottom, she's still connected to a group. And you'll see how the groups move a little bit. There's a lot of stability in those groups, but there is movement. And what's amazing is that kids recognize the difference in a short period of time. They're much better than the adults. Adults have more issues with this, but the kids are great. Okay, next slide. So we also know that the peer-mediated intervention resulted in the child with autism getting more nominations of friends. So more kids, not just the 3 peers, but other kids in the class nominated the child with autism as a friend. They were less isolated on the playground when we had people observe them. And teachers said that their social skills were better in the classroom. So all of those things were better. Next slide. So what did we learn? So one is that teaching peers about engaging all children makes the biggest difference. We also learned that children who did have a friend in the class, so a reciprocated friendship, so if I said, you're my friend, and you said, I'm your friend, those kids were not any more engaged on the playground if they had autism, all right? So that's one thing that the study wasn't successful at. And the other thing was that the one-on-one aids that children had also did not improve engagement. So a one-on-one aid attached to a child in the classroom wasn't helpful. So it told us that the playground was a really tough environment and that we probably needed a very specific intervention for a playground, which is something we're in the process of doing now. But I want to show you one of the things that we are trying to do is to connect kids before they go out to the playground. Because one of the issues is that playgrounds, I don't know, I'm sure it's the same in Russia, is that they're kind of crazy places. The kids are running around, they're very busy, they're very crowded. And sometimes, even if you have a friend in the classroom and you have autism, when you get to the playground, you've lost your friend, you can't find them. So one way to connect kids is to keep them connected as they leave the classroom and go to the playground. So I'll show you a video of 2 little boys who are told to have a conversation on the way out to the playground. He's trying to negotiate free time and play, and
Now you
I
guys
forget.
need to have
Anyway,
a
they're the same
conversation
thing.
about something and walk.
boys. So these are boys in inclusion. It's an inclusive classroom. And I want you to tell me which child has autism. This is also Los Angeles. This is our lab school, so it's beautiful. Not so typical. So you can see those two boys are still connected once they get to the sand. This little boy is not. That's a typical child, by the way. What about those two boys? Do either of them have autism? You think?
One who talked about robots. I'm translating.
One that talked about robots? They actually both have autism.
No, other people say no, the next one.
Right, because they both have autism. That's why. That was a trick. But they've had a lot of therapy. So they're both in inclusive settings. But it does help to transition kids out to the playground together so that they maintain that connection. So the next slide then, we have a lot of materials for teachers and particularly for the adults who are on the playground. So we have a intervention we call Remaking Recess, trying to make it a happier, more connected place for our kids with autism who sometimes are very isolated on playgrounds or who get bullied by other kids. All right. So conclusion. So one major point is that targeting interventions on engagement is probably an active ingredient of interventions, at least with young kids with autism. And then still with older kids, although you can see that it changes. So we're working on sort of play and more cognitive language skills with young children. As children get older and maybe higher functioning, we're still working on engagement, but our methods have changed. I think it's important to think about the strategies that are effective, and so that's part of what we study, because those strategies are what we can then effectively deploy, as opposed to some complicated intervention requiring a lot of training. That's going to be very difficult for people to pick up on. And so I think that in the United States, there are lots of people studying interventions and those very specific strategies or targets that are important to think about. And then parents and teachers really need to know what to do in a very brief period of time. So again, knowing what those active ingredients are is really, really critical, and then integrating our approaches. So we know when to use direct instruction, so more of the practice, repetitive kinds of drills versus a developmental strategy. So the combination is important, but knowing when to use them is critical. And then, of course, these kinds of treatments are going to be easier just to bring to scale and to include more kids in more places. So thank you.
Спасибо большое.
Спасибо огромное. Просто самый впечатляющий для меня доклад на этой конференции. Хорошо. Спасибо, потому что я считаю, что для детей, особенно первого, второго класса, которые только что пришли в школу, и, как вы говорите, если это обычное дело, что говорящие дети, да, аутисты, то есть аспергеры, как правило, высоко функционирующие, приходят в обычную школу, то в России это выглядит очень часто весьма проблематично, и в первом классе ребенок нуждается в помощи именно на игровой площадке. Это просто действительно должно быть целью и заботой учителя и помощника. Вопрос мой, это большая благодарность вам за тему, которую вы здесь подняли. А вопрос в том состоит, что всегда ли это делают какие-то специальные люди, тьюторы или обученные люди, профессионалы, или это отдается на откуп учителю, и если да, то обучают ли его как-то, хотя бы коротко, и как мотивируют, тоже коротко. Спасибо.
Спасибо за вопрос.
So are you talking about the playground intervention?
Yes.
Yes. Oh, so those are what they're called in the United States are paraprofessionals or aides. They are not trained professionals. They are usually people with a high school education, whatever that translates to, or less. So they are just people on the play yard who typically in the United States stand around and talk with their friends and watch to make sure nobody falls off a play structure, but don't do anything else. And so what we've done is we give them a very brief kind of orientation to what we're talking about, and then we give them a lot of tools. We give them handouts. We give them what we call social menus, which I didn't show you. There are different little strips of paper, different little jokes and sayings on them that are different every day, and they hand them out to the kids so that at lunchtime they have something to talk about. The kids love them. Mostly the typical kids love them. And then from there, they transition out to play yard, and they're taught how to do different games. We have a zillion games that they can pull from, and they just start the game, and their goal is to fade themselves out, but just to get kids connected. It's very simple, so simple.
Спасибо. Последний вопрос, потому что все время, к сожалению.
Добрый день. Скажите, пожалуйста, Конни, работаете ли вы с неанглоговорящими детьми? Если да, возможно ли работа с русскоговорящими детьми? И если да, то как можно к вам обратиться?
Okay, so in Los Angeles, right? Los Angeles Unified School District, we have 12,000 kids with autism. 75% of the kids are Latino. They come from Spanish-speaking backgrounds. So we speak Spanish. I don't speak Spanish, but my therapist speaks Spanish or Korean. We also have a large Korean or Vietnamese. So we have some languages that we use because kids speak different languages in Los Angeles. Russian is not one of them. Although I've had a couple of Russian kids, and I have a Russian therapist in the lab, but I don't speak Russian. But yeah, we work, I mean, it doesn't matter what language, as long as you can translate, we can teach, you can use whatever language to do the therapy, of course.